Thank you. So a quick show of hands over here. How many of you studied Leonardo da Vinci when you were in school? A few of you? Okay. How many of you would be able to list, out of those that lifted their hands, the few that lifted their hands, in school, when you studied Leonardo da Vinci, you obviously learned about some of his inventions. Would you be in a position to list out maybe one or two of his inventions that we use today? Any of you over here? So the reason I bring that up, and let me just explain this. At the Castellier School in Palo Alto, California, there was a history teacher. And the challenge that she faced with her class, which included students which probably were not very different than yourselves, was that she really wanted them to fully appreciate the genius of the multi-talented Leonardo da Vinci. And this is how she went about it. She asked them to build a working model of any one of Leonardo da Vinci's inventions. The students responded magnificently. They went online, they researched all of Leonardo da Vinci's inventions, picked the one that they really wanted to build, downloaded Leonardo da Vinci's original sketches, figured out what the moving parts of that invention were, then prototyped those parts in the makerspace that they had in their school. They've got a lab called the Born Idea Lab within Castellier School. And this is where they built these parts. And finally, they assembled them. At the end of the day, some of those assemblies worked, many of them did not. And the students had to go through this very frustrating process of iterating again and again and again to get it to work. At the end of that unit, some of those assemblies were working, some of those weren't. But regardless, every single child in that class, bar none, had a robust appreciation of the genius of Leonardo da Vinci with the kind of personal conviction and authority that would have been impossible for that history teacher to achieve through any other means. The learning goal that she had set for herself was spectacularly achieved. Maker spaces, fab labs or fabrication labs, tinkering areas are a global phenomenon. These are a place where a bunch of very creative, hands-on, resourceful types will get together to give a very solid form to an abstract idea in their mind. Children are by their very nature makers. They are drawn by their innate curiosity to make sense of the world around them using their tactile faculties. And so you'd think that it's natural probably for such a maker space to exist within an educational institution. And you'd be right. The amount of interest that schools and colleges around the world are showing in having such a maker space built into them is skyrocketing. Now, these maker spaces in education aren't a new phenomenon, really. So before our current design for schools, where you've got these homogeneous classrooms where students learn the ways of the world and the wisdom of the universe from the pages of these very sterile, boring textbooks, most educating really happened in maker spaces. So in those days, if you wanted to learn to farm, you had to go out on a farm. If you wanted to learn to do blacksmithy, you had to go out into a forge. If you wanted to learn to be a baker, you had to go into a kitchen. The very famous educator, Piaget, in his constructivist theory of learning, has said that we learn best by doing. Building on that, the late great Seymour Papert from MIT, in his constructionist theory, said that we build on our existing knowledge to construct new knowledge for ourselves. Both of these theories of learning form the bedrock for most activities that you would see in maker spaces in educational institutions. Now, these spaces in educational institutions will usually come in a number of different shapes and sizes. From the fab labs at MIT, where you've got a multi-million-dollar set of equipment in there, to these really low-cost, low-tech maker spaces that a Dutch team put together for under a couple $1,000. Regardless, every single one of them will have a few common characteristics. The first characteristic is this, that the institution that decides to have a maker space in it needs to be bold, creative, and really ready to do whatever it takes to offer the best possible education for its students. And that's because having such a space in your school or college involves more than just a financial or a logistical decision. It's predominantly a pedagogical decision where the way you teach will be changing completely. So for example, in the traditional science lab that you and I have probably experienced, where you had a teacher in a lab who was the resident experts on everything that was going on in there and would tell you to do an experiment where there would be a start point, there'd be an end point, and there'd be a few intermediate steps, and she'd be the authority on all of those things. In a makerspace, things would be very different. Your end goal would be sort of loosely defined. The intermediate steps would not be given to you, and you'd have to figure it out and be at your own devices to figure out what those intermediate steps are. And finally, the teacher in there would not be the resident expert on how to get from point A to point B. So if you had, for example, a class of, say, 30 students, you probably would have 30 different ways to get from point A to point B. So you'd probably get a box of stuff, and you'd be told, build a car. And with 30 students, there'd be 30 different ways that they'd figure out to build a car from the stuff in the box. And the teacher probably wouldn't know about, the way to build a car that the 29 of those students actually came out with. So very different kind of pedagogical way of doing things that you'd see over here. My team were designing an innovation academy in the Western Indian city of Surat, where we decided that this was going to be a school where we'd nurture creative talent for the ages to come. And so we obviously decided that we wanted to have a maker space in there. But building that maker space in there wasn't just a one-off decision. We had to change the entire blueprint of the school as we knew it, from the curriculum, to the schedules, to the kinds of teachers that we hired, to the kind of training that we offered them, to the kind of content we taught them, the kind of assessments or exams that we offered, and last but not the least, of course, the architecture and the interiors. So for example, here is a double-height space that we turned into the innovation lab or the maker space that the students currently use in that school. Keep in mind over here, thank you. Keep in mind over here that it's not just the school that will actually be taking the risks over here. Think about it from the perspective of a parent. The kind of parent that would be comfortable with their child going through this very fundamentally different kind of education too has to be cut from a very different kind of cloth. So when you have such a space, the other thing that really becomes important is the kind of people that you hire for such a space. If you talk to principals in these schools, they will tell you that the number one issue that they have is that in the beginning, teachers really don't know what kind of power has been placed at their disposal when such a makerspace is made available to their students. The other thing that principals will tell you is that teachers are really reluctant to use such a space without the right kind of hand-holding. And so inevitably, every such makerspace will at least have that one individual who is the tent pole type of a personality, who keeps that entire place together and running. This is a person usually who'd be very tech-savvy, who'd be creative, who'd be very nurturing, very collegial, a maker in every sense of the word. Most importantly, this would be a person that would be a die-hard cheerleader for the teachers and the students. Very important for this person. Thirdly, this space needs to really know what is its place in the larger mission to educate the students. So if it's a space that is in a school, for example, you really need to make sure that it is reinforcing and supporting whatever is happening in the classroom. So for example, in the classroom, if you're learning Newton's laws of physics, the kinds of activities that you should see in such a maker space need to be the type that would actually natively allow the student to come to a first-hand discovery of the very same Newton's laws of physics on his or her own. And so, for example, here are a group of students as part of their environmental sciences class that were given a mission to figure out how they would measure rain. And so they're using, reusable plastic bottles to build a rain gauge and then test it out in the rain. Here's another group of students that were asked to build a wind vane, a way to actually measure which direction the wind is going in. And again, as you can see, a couple of very different designs that came out of this exercise. Finally, you really need to know how you're going to pay for this space in terms of building it, as well as running it on an ongoing basis. As far as the startup costs of a place like this are concerned, usually that would come from the school, that could come from some sort of a grant, or if it's a for-profit makerspace that you're building, it could come from an investor. However, the important part is if you want this to be a self-sustaining space in the long run, you've got to really make sure that the running costs are offset by the ongoing revenues that you see over here. The website FabWiki lists a number of business models that can help you with this, but the ones that are the most relevant in this situation are, for example, some sort of a subscription-based model or having a pay-per-use model to line up your costs and your revenues. Now let's for a minute talk about how is such a space relevant to you guys, the youth. If you're an educator, as I've already made the case, such a space can be a force multiplier. It can make you an outstanding teacher who can really help that latent knowledge in the student germinate. If you are a parent, you don't need to wait for such a space to be made available in the school. You could build such a tiny, in a corner of your house, you could build a tiny space with nothing more than just scissors, newspaper, and glue. And there's a number of books on home-based maker activities that you could actually use to do that. If you are a student, I would recommend you actually visit one of these places because I know of nobody that's walked out from one of these places without learning something and really enjoying that experience. If you are an entrepreneur, there are several business models that can help you to profitably bring this much needed service to the thousands of students out there that could really, really use it. So for example, here in California is Spark Truck, a company that puts maker spaces into the back of a truck and then drives them from school to school to school as a shared resource so that every school doesn't have to build its own maker space. Or here in Bangalore, you've got workbench projects who are, when they're not using their space as a subscription-based service for students, are going to use that maker space for corporates. And there's a number of corporates with whom they have long-term relationships to really infuse that creativity and innovation into that corporate DNA of that company. If you are anyone with an idea that you never did anything about, and I'm assuming that this is a TED audience, so I'm assuming that that pretty much covers every single one of you. If you're someone that had an idea and never did anything about it, a makerspace is where you should really be heading to turn that into reality. So whether it is an idea to end world hunger, or it's just this really cool surprise recipe that you want to spring on your mother on her birthday, go for it, go for it. Finally, I just want to say this, that I look forward to such maker spaces really being the norm rather than an exception. I look forward to the day when such spaces are at the center of the mission to educate rather than being at the periphery. Because in a world like ours, which is moving from manufacturing-based economies to these very knowledge-based entrepreneurial economies, the kind of gift that you give these kids when you offer them access to such a maker space goes far beyond just the communication skills, the teamwork, and helping the kids to tap into their latent creativity. The gift that you give them will be that of taking initiative, of being self-reliant, of really rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty. The gift that you give them is of being resourceful and making do with the equipment and the materials that they have to solve the problem at hand. The gift that you give them is one of being tenacious and of never giving up until they've actually solved the problem at hand. Because really, if you think about this, when these kids actually get into this mode of thinking, the mindset that you give them is one where they really are not limited by any boundaries except the ones that they set themselves. You teach them that the wisdom of the universe is within them, just waiting to be mined. Last but not the least, you teach them that if Leonardo da Vinci could build it, so can they. Thank you.